My name is Dimitar. I work for the Martens Centre in Brussels. The Martens Centre is the official think tank of the European People's Party. We are also the political foundation of the EPP. We work with many centre-right political organizations and like-minded organizations across the continent. It's a pleasure to be here with Kompassi, Christian Democrats in Finland. We always look forward to interesting projects and publications with member parties and foundations in different member states. My presentation has the very ambitious title of Energy and Environment Policy Beyond 2020. It's an extremely broad topic. Given the speakers who are going to talk after me, who are going to focus on innovation, technology, I will focus on political aspects and also focus on the classical aspects of energy policy and the future environmental policy of the European Union. And I remind you, I will focus also on politics and Europe on a macro level, hopefully also touching upon points which are very interesting and important for Finland as well. I have around 30 minutes for this presentation, so the brief outline, 5 or 10 minutes on energy, 5 or 10 on environment, extremely important politics of climate change and the East-West divide in Europe. I think it will be interesting for you, maybe if I could give you the perspective from Central and Eastern Europe on climate change. I'm Bulgarian myself. One thing is to speak about climate change, energy and environment in Finland or in Sweden or in Denmark, and it's a completely different story to have this conversation in Central or Eastern Europe. So I think this is a very, very important point when we talk about our common European policy in the future. I'll touch upon briefly towards the end on the climate change challenge for the center, right? Because the center-right in Europe right now finds itself in a specific position when it comes to climate change. And lastly, carbon neutrality by 2050, which is the topic of today. EU Energy 2020-2030, I'll try to look at the most important trends in the next 10 years. Of course, groundbreaking innovation or technology is always a potential to disrupt the market and the way we use energy, but I'll focus on the classical aspects of energy policy. For me, this is an extremely important slide. You can see in the last decade the energy dependency rate of the European Union. The EU imports more than half of its energy. Oil, about 80% traditionally, natural gas, between 60 and 70% of its usage, solid and fossil fuels. So again, more than half of the energy the European Union is using is coming from the outside. Oil. Surprise, surprise, we're importing a third of our oil from Russia. The good thing is that there's a variety of other partners who are also contributing in this endeavor, but Russia remains the biggest importer. Norway, of course, is a reliable partner when we talk about oil and natural gas, and a number of other countries. Something important to note, some of these countries have fragilities. Some of these countries have political fragilities, Northern Africa, Middle East. Some of these countries have fragilities in their infrastructure. The infrastructure is liable, can be attacked, is vulnerable for outside influence. The Saudi Arabia drone strike, which happened, was it a week ago, which disrupted Saudi Arabia's oil supply and oil exports, shows that these partners, even though we depend on them, they can be vulnerable. And if some of these countries are disrupted, for better or worse, we turn to Russia. If we need additional secure supplies of oil, the EU relies on the Russian Federation. This is the domestic production of natural gas in the European Union in the last 20 years. I'm not fully aware if all of you are aware, but the EU has been producing less and less natural gas domestically. Our strongholds are Norway, the United Kingdom, the Groningen fields in Netherlands, to name just a few. But for various reasons, environmental, ecological, economic, or depletion of the natural gas reserves, in the last 20 years, you can see a substantial drop of the domestic production of natural gas in the European Union. This trend is expected to get even worse In Netherlands, the Groningen natural gas fields will produce less and less natural gas. Norway is projected to either stabilize its production or even drop a bit. The United Kingdom as well. So we're facing a situation in which the EU is trying to diversify its energy mix. It's trying to cut down on coal. It's trying to invest more in renewables, but at the same time, our own production of natural gas is going down. And our natural gas consumption is going up. In the next decade, I mean, going above 2030 is a bit difficult to project, but in the next 5 to 10 years, for sure the EU will require more natural gas. You can see the different segments. This is Europe and Eurasia. As you can see, it's been constantly growing. This is the gas consumption. So we have less gas being produced in Europe, but we will need more and more gas in the future, 5 to 10 years. Where do we get our natural gas? You're fully aware the European Union is not fully, thank God, not fully dependent on the Russian Federation for natural gas, but a large chunk of natural gas we import comes from Russia, comes from Gazprom. Norway is an extremely important, reliable partner, but as I mentioned, it is projected that Norwegian supply is going to either stabilize or even go down in the next 5 to 10 years. Our third biggest importer is Algeria. Algeria is also expected to cut down on its production and on its export in the next 5 to 10 years. So we're faced with the dilemma that we want to be less dependent on the Russian Federation for natural gas, but we are becoming more and more dependent on the Russian Federation for natural gas. As you can see, even from 2017 to 2018, our imports increased from Russia, even though we have a European Energy Union, which one of its fundamental goals is to diversify our energy supply and to be less dependent on the Russian Federation. This is not happening. Now, I'll come back to natural gas in Russia in a bit. I just want to go through all of our classical energy resources so we can draw some conclusions. Renewables. This is one of the hottest topics when we talk about energy and climate change. Young people outside, if you stop them in the street and ask them what's going to be the future for energy, renewables, right? Yes and no. Renewables are extremely important component of the clean energy transition in the next decade. The European Union has put tremendous effort in investing in renewable energy, and this is something extremely important and something extremely positive. But I'm showing you this slide to remind you that the picture is not that clear-cut across Europe. As I said, it's very easy to talk about renewables and clean energy in Scandinavia. But when we go south, when we go to Central Europe, when we go to Eastern Europe, it's a completely different picture. By 2020, the European Union hopefully is going to achieve its goal to have 20% of its energy mix coming from renewables. This was a very important goal which was set 10 years ago or so. Many member states have outdone this goal and have made tremendous leaps forward. But look at the national 2020 targets, not the European overall target. Look at the national targets for 2020. We have, I would say, close to half of the European Union member states still below their 2020 targets, and at least 10 European member states will not achieve their renewables 2020 national targets. In the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a big discrepancy between Northern and Western Europe, which will be the champion of renewables, but we will have Central, Southern, and Eastern economies which still didn't manage to invest sufficient resources in renewable energy. So it's very tempting to speak about renewables on the macro-European level when we chase specific targets, 20% renewables, 30% renewables. The European Union goal, by the way, for 2030 for renewables is 32%. This is a significant number. If in the next decade we have more than 30% of our energy coming from renewables, this will be something fantastic. But I think that in the near future, this will be achieved by the rich, prosperous economies. This will not be so easy in Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Nuclear. I think Finland is a fan of nuclear energy. You have nuclear power plants in the country. Finland is one of the 14 European member states which relies on nuclear energy for its clean electricity. 14 member states have nuclear energy. I think it's above 120 nuclear power plants in Europe. And again, there's a little split. Half of Europe has nuclear energy, a specific part of Europeans trust this source of energy, they like it, they rely on it. But there's a growing pressure on politicians and a growing, not only lobby, but also people with natural personal concerns whether this is safe energy. The projections for next decade are that there will be new power plants, of course, in Europe. We're not going to phase out nuclear energy, but it will remain more or less the same, because we will have some nuclear reactors in Europe which will be phased out. Their natural lifespan will expire. New investment in power plants is a bit expensive and tricky, and more governments are faced with more and more media and citizen scrutiny on these decisions. Look at Germany. Germany pledged to phase out its nuclear energy by 2023, which is quite soon. So we cannot really predict that nuclear energy is going to increase its role in the European energy mix in the next decade. Right now, 1/4, 25–27% of Europeans' electricity comes from nuclear, and this is carbon-free electricity. This is clean energy, which is an extremely important component. But as I said, it's going to either be stable in the next 5–10 years or even drop a bit. So I start wondering if renewables are not going to immediately solve our energy needs, if nuclear is going to stay more or less the same, if we're phasing out coal, if we're saying no to coal, when are we going to get our energy from? I mean, I remind you again, I'm not talking here about innovation and technology, which is extremely important. I'm talking about the classic energy sources. Let's get back to natural gas. 40% of our import comes from Russia, as I mentioned. And I want to outline for you now in the next couple of minutes what's set for the European Union in the next decade when it comes to energy, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to infrastructure. This is the planned Nord Stream 2 pipeline coming directly from Russia to Germany. This is the current Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which is currently operational. It's been operational for the last 7–8 years. And this is the planned Nord Stream 2 route, which is exactly the same volume of natural gas, exactly the same route. The idea is that the Russians want to double the capacities they're transferring directly to Germany, to put it in a very brief, simple nutshell. With the Martens Centre, I was one of the authors of the publication, The Case Against Nord Stream 2. I'm biased. I'm of course against this project because of political reasons. You can check out our publication online. It's called The Case Against Nord Stream 2. So excuse my bias against the Russian Federation in this project, but if this project goes forward, and most likely it will go forward, there's been a number of technicalities. The European Commission right now is pushing against this. But Berlin and Moscow managed to negotiate this project. Most of the pipelines have been built. By the way, Finland in 2018 gave its permission, its environmental permission, that the pipeline goes through its territorial waters. Almost all member states of the European Union said okay. Only Denmark, by the way, an interesting fact, only Denmark for now hasn't issued its opinion whether Nord Stream 2 can pass through its territorial waters because of environmental and defense concerns. But Gazprom is ready for, if Denmark says no to this project, Gazprom will just change the route and circumvent Denmark and manage to complete their project without even Denmark's permission. So what's the problem with this pipeline? The problem with this pipeline is that, first of all, it was negotiated without the agreement of the European Union. It was negotiated bilaterally between Berlin and Moscow, because Germany needs direct natural gas for its industry. As I said, Germany will phase out its nuclear power plants in the next couple of years. It needs a reliable source of natural gas, and the Russians are promising cheaper natural gas. There's five European businesses, big companies from Germany, the UK, Netherlands, and Austria, who have invested half of the money for this project. So big energy companies are also interested in this. And it looks like this project will come to fruition. Why is this a problem? It is a problem because this project does not bring new natural gas to Europe. The only idea of this project is to cut out Ukraine as a transit country to Europe. This is the main intention of Vladimir Putin and Gazprom. They're looking in ways to ensure that Gazprom remains the future supplier to Europe in the next couple of decades, cutting Ukraine out from this business. And why is this a problem? It's a problem because if you redirect all the natural gas from Russia to Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and these pipelines have very big volumes, they can transport up to 100 billion cubic meters of natural gas, which is around 80% of the gas we get from Russia. So Russia intends to push most of its gas direct to Germany and then transfer it to Central Europe. All of the other Central and Eastern European countries which are reliant on gas will not have the pipeline coming from Ukraine. This is a clear threat to their energy security. In 2009, when there was a big problem between Russia and Ukraine, and the Russians stopped transferring gas to Ukraine, Eastern Europe was left to freeze during the winter. And I think Finland is, together with 7 other European member states, which is fully dependent on Russia for natural gas. I think Finland does not use its natural gas directly for heating of its homes and households, but 100% of the gas which Finland requires comes from the Russian Federation. So we're looking into a decade in which Russia ensures that it becomes and it stays the dominant supplier of natural gas. A second project from Russia right now is also being constructed. This is the third stream. This is south. The idea is to transfer gas from Russia directly to Turkey, and then a pipeline going to Bulgaria or Greece. So to remind you and to wrap up, if this is the European map, right now Russia aims to cut out Ukraine as a transit country. It aims to invest in infrastructure south and north, and to ensure that it remains the main supplier of natural gas to Europe. Why is this a problem? Well, in 2015, the European Commission basically said that Russia and Gazprom are doing terrible things in Central and Eastern Europe. Russia is exploiting its position, its monopolistic position as exporting natural gas, and it's extorting European member states. You can see how Gazprom is extorting these countries. This is from 2015. It was a big legal case from the European Commission aimed at Gazprom. Now this case is settled. Gazprom made specific measures to address these problems. But in 2015, the European Commission more or less proved that Gazprom is, number one, preventing cross-border flows of gas, so making sure that countries remain inflexible, overcharging for gas prices in a number of European countries, and the third point, which is the worst in my opinion, extracting commitments in return for gas. Basically exchanging political favors in order to ensure supply of natural gas. This is 2015. Gazprom made certain measures to address these problems. But still, they're a monopolistic position, and they can take advantage of different economies and different smaller, weaker member states, especially former Soviet republics or in their sphere of influence. So to wrap up, on the energy front, we cannot fully rely on renewables, of course, for our energy mix in the next 10 years. Nuclear will remain stable or go down in the next 5 to 10 years. We're phasing out coal. We're going to rely more and more on natural gas. We're going to need natural gas, but the European production of natural gas is declining. So the EU finds itself in a situation in which the infrastructure and the whole constellation of its energy policy is going to be fully or mostly dependent on the Russian Federation. I put a little US LNG question mark sign there. There's potential for the import of liquefied natural gas from America or from other countries. For the moment, these imports remain costly. They are an option, of course. This is part of the diversification efforts of the European Union. But as I said, this remains costly, and secondly, there are growing environmental concerns whether LNG gas is actually sustainable when it comes to methane levels, when it comes to environmental impact. So LNG is something that is welcomed as a potential source of diversification, but it's not really certain whether we can fully rely on LNG in the future. This is important food for thought when it comes to energy in the next 10 years. Turning to environment, and again, I will not talk about emission targets that much. I'm not going to talk about the threats to our environment and our ecosystem, which is a fact. I want to speak about the political implications of climate change in the European level on a macro perspective. I was looking at this slide a couple of weeks ago, and on the face of it, of course, this is a fact. European cities are already, on average, warmer than in the 20th century. I mean, we're not going to debate on this, but it occurred to me that there's maybe little geographic variations in this, and I started thinking, is climate change impacting the continent evenly? There's differences. Let's look into this. I find this fascinating. Look at air quality in the European Union. This is the air quality index. I'm not really sure which exact month this was made. Maybe it was made in the winter to make the point more emphatic. Look at the split between West and East. It's fantastic. I mean, fantastic is a terrible word. It's fascinating in a negative sense. As I said, I come from Eastern Europe. Look at the division when we talk about climate change. There are studies which prove that Central and Eastern European countries are actually one of the biggest losers of climate change when it comes to GDP. Air quality is worse and worse. Go to Sofia or Skopje in Macedonia in wintertime and you'll see what I mean. But on the other hand, these countries are the less committed politically to climate change. It's a growing paradox why Central and Eastern European countries, even though they're impacted and they're losing money, they're losing lives because of climate change, and yet measures are still in their infancy. A very important aspect of climate change as well, sure, renewables, green energy, and so on and so forth, but this comes at an economic price. There's 250,000 approximate direct jobs in coal and mining and power plants in Europe. And because of the transition to a green economy, which we all strive to, this will mean that many people, or specific people in specific age groups, potentially will lose their jobs. Not only that, but the economic pain of this transition is going to be felt again in different regions. Northern Europe, Western Europe will be less heavily impacted by this transition. But in Central and Eastern Europe, there's going to be pain. There's going to be pain because people are not that flexible. There are not enough measures to support people finding new jobs, getting retrained, getting prepared, re-educated, and so on and so forth. So climate change transition comes as a price for different countries and different member states. But again, I want to show you that there's a geographic division when it comes to this cost. I put on little but green jobs. The renewable sector and the green economy offers amazing opportunities for employment. And it's also projected that this can compensate for the losses in the traditional carbon sectors, coal sectors, for example. But re-educating people in green jobs and working with renewables and becoming part of the clean economy is costly. It cannot happen overnight. So when we talk about climate change and we talk about the green transition, you should never forget that this comes at a cost. This comes to social cost. Now, building up on this argument, and I want to speak about the center-right dilemma on this issue as well. Question: which of the following do you consider to be the single most serious problem facing the world as a whole? Green, climate change. So the majority of the population thinks that climate change is a huge problem for the world. Surprise, surprise. Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Malta, UK, Netherlands, Austria. Which part of Europe are these countries in? A huge bulk of countries think that poverty, hunger, and lack of drinking water is a huge problem. These are Luxembourg, France, Portugal, Greece, and so on. And look at Central and Eastern European economies. They're saying that international terrorism is a huge problem. Now, we're not going to talk why these countries think like this, because political narratives, because different economic realities, and so on and so forth. But this, again, is a reminder. It's a little proof that there's a huge division when we talk about climate change. You cannot build a political campaign on climate change in Poland and be elected prime minister. You can do it in Sweden, maybe, or in Germany, but not in this region of Europe. Why is there such a split between Northwestern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, also Southern Europe, on climate change? We read news reports, we look at the results from the European elections. Liberal media, progressive media is more or less shaming Central and Eastern Europe, or shaming people who are not that engaged with climate change policies or topics. It's very easy to say, well, these people are, ill-informed, or they don't believe in climate change, or they're not progressive enough. But I think there's at least 5 different reasons why is there such a big split in Europe when we talk about climate change. And it's a paradoxical situation, because as I said, the East and Central Europe suffers from climate change. People see this in their everyday lives. There's bad air quality, there's bad automobiles, there isn't, environmental stations are not working perfectly. Go to some seasides and there's still problems with water sanitation and so on and so forth. So people are aware of these problems, but why they're not politically engaged? First of all, of course, material standard. How can you advocate climate change measures when you cannot pay your bills and when you cannot really afford a car or a holiday? Many people in Central and Eastern Europe see this as luxury problems. They see this as problems of the well-developed Western economies. Don't talk to me about climate change when I cannot feed my kids. I think this is logical. Secondly, economic policies. You saw the renewable map of Europe. If you're a prime minister in Central and Eastern Europe, you cannot really allocate that much resources for renewables or for wind farms, or put a diesel tax on your population, because this is going to backfire. Look what happened in France when Macron, out of really genuine intents, put a tax on diesel. People were out on the streets because of 10% increase in their bills. Can you blame the people? I don't know. But it's very difficult to implement climate-friendly economic policies when you're running a very tight budget, when you're outside of the Schengen zone, when you're outside of the Eurozone, when you're faced with migration pressures coming from Turkey, for example, or coming from Northern Africa, these policies are not very politically friendly for the electorates in Central and Eastern Europe. Number 3, individual choices. Why are people in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, not really engaged with climate change? I remember in the 90s, the hyperinflation in Bulgaria, 20 years ago. We were waiting for money from the International Monetary Fund. We were really ambitious and aspiring to become part of the European community. People like me who remember inflation, people like me who spend their lives waiting to improve their economic standard, to be able to travel, to be able to explore the world and be part of this globalized middle class and globalized elite. Now you have people from Brussels, that's the picture for many people. Now people are telling you, stop flying. I'm gonna fly. You're not gonna use specific products, you're not gonna drive your car, and you have to adapt your individual lifestyle. Yes, sure, but I waited all my life to be able to tap into this material comfort, to be able to leave something material in terms of material gain for my children, and now you have politicians who are telling me I have to adapt my lifestyle. Sure, I understand this, but many people are not willing to make these sacrifices. It's as if you're imposing a specific type of new austerity, because we had austerity in the last decade, right? Financial austerity. We had to tighten our belts. Now many people are saying, well, now I have to tighten my belt and tell my kid not to fly to America or whatever, and to give him a proper education or be engaged in business trips, because these liberal policies from Brussels. I'm speaking here very simplistically. Don't take me verbatim, don't think that I'm saying that I approve of this. But I'm trying to explain that for a majority of the people in these parts of Europe, this is a problematic narrative. This is a problematic push. I've waited all my life for prosperity and European ideals, and now you're telling me that I shouldn't have them or limit them. Point number 4. Narrative and malicious influences on climate change. Sounds a bit weird, but let me elaborate. In Brussels, in Northern Europe, in Western Europe, there's consensus that we have to address this problem. People see this as a no-brainer, people see this as something we should not challenge. I agree. But in the South, and especially in Central and Eastern Europe, this narrative is seen as a specific liberal progressive agenda. And many people, on a very personal identity basis, they do not agree with this. They see people who are advocating for climate change measures, they see them as progressive, they see them as pro-gay, they see them as pro-gay marriage, they see them as pro-migration. There's, in many people's heads, it's a whole package of a political narrative that they do not subscribe to. People in these countries are socially conservative. And right now, what I put malicious influences, the Russian Federation and China knows that there is separation of identities in Europe. And every time you log into social media, when you look at the news cycles, believe me, all the enemies of the European Union are making sure that we're becoming more and more divided on this issue. If I want to cause divisions in the EU, I'm going to invest in amplifying these clashes on climate. The video from Greta Thunberg the other day in the United Nations, the same photo, the same video now gets absolutely parallel interpretations from different countries and different people. Gotta be passionate. But please see this as a huge identity problem as well, because these narratives are not easy for many people. Now, quickly, center-right dilemma. What does this all mean for the center-right parties of the EPP? This is the elections seats, and again, Why am I focused so much on geography? Because all of my lecture leads to this final point. Look at the strongest, the member states which gave the most seats to DP, which gave the most seats to center right. Germany was doing okay, but not as before. Most of the EPP member parties are strongest in Central and Eastern Europe and also in Southern Europe. So now the EPP is facing a huge challenge. The leaders of these parties know that they have to address the climate issue, but they're operating in a specific geography, and also their electorate is in a specific demographic gap. People usually above 40. This is the demographics of people who support center-right parties. These are people who are socially conservative, who are structurally conservative. DP center-right parties have a problem when they communicate on climate change. 10 years ago, very, very few parties were actually building their platforms on climate change. Now they have to change their communication. Now the EPP parties across Europe have to adapt their policies and manage to sell them to their electorate. And how can the EPP position itself when faced with so much pressure from the leftists, the progressives, and the Greens? They are dominating the climate change debate. How can the center-right parties readapt their strategies and manage to turn the argument and develop a coherent argument on climate change? 2 more minutes, I'm closing. This is my own creation, just to, again, exemplify the problem very, very quickly. This is a mental exercise. If we do a little timeline, the climate change spectrum, as I call it, if this is, stakeholders who are advocating the most pro-green, progressive policies to tackle climate change and to transition to a green economy, off the grid there is Trump. Here is maybe climate radicals who say I'm not going to have a child because I don't want this child to live in post-apocalypse times. The EPP maybe is somewhere here. The European Commission and von der Leyen, they're a bit more progressive on these policies. The European Parliament, a bit to here the Greens. But as I said, the EPP is here, and some of its member parties are even there. Whereas the EPP president is more on the green side, let's put it that. So you can see this visually, it's a problem. How to make this, how to address this, how to make the center-right parties become, agree on a specific, more progressive narrative on climate change and address these problems. Final slide, 2020 and beyond. The dilemmas. How do we diversify energy sources and reduce our dependence on Russia? How to phase out fossil fuels without causing social unrest? How to ensure the clean transition and remain globally competitive? China is making huge progress on clean energy, on electric vehicles. How to actually make our economies not only greener, but also competitive? How to make sure that the United States, India, China, Mexico, Latin America are also on board. The EU contributes to less than 10% of the CO2 emissions globally, less than 10%. Even if we become the best example on the globe, and I hope we do, we are not going to solve the problem. We need to get the other big polluters on board. How can we overcome the policy gap and bridge the East-West divide? As I said, it's a huge problem. And it's a question to all of you. I'll be really interested to talk with you after this event. What political narrative for the center-right beyond the technical measures and beyond targets? What emotional argument in order to engage these people who are structurally conservative in this ambitious effort? And closing, because the title of this event is Towards Carbon Neutrality or Increased Fragility, if I'm not mistaken, it's a question. Towards Carbon Neutrality or Increased Fragility is a question. I'll just give you, this is the high-level conclusions from the European Council this summer. And the European Union pledged to ensure a transition to a climate neutral EU in line with the Paris Agreement. Great. That will, number one, preserve European competitiveness, be just and socially balanced, take account of member states' national circumstances, and also respect their right to decide on their energy mix while building on the measures. This is the goal of the European Union, to become carbon neutral by 2050. Do you see how many ifs and how many difficult challenges are in this little sentence? Remain competitive, respect national circumstances, but also ensure a clean transition and be just and socially balanced, without revolts on the streets. So if I have to answer the question towards carbon neutrality or increased fragility, my answer is yes. Yes to both, because the European Commission is firmly committed. Hopefully we're going to go to 2050 carbon neutral, but the member states are not there yet. We have to address this. Neither our European societies nor our member states are fully and actually willing to make this transition to carbon neutrality. This is the political reality. We have to be aware of this. Thank you very much.